Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, The Invisible Man. Last words were that. Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot and said, "Stop," with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said. "Who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose. It was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh my God," said one. Then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobble-hoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled and everyone else down the steps. For the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid, gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness. No visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down and Mr. Teddy Henry jump to avoid tumbling over her. And then they heard the frightful screams of Milly, who, emerging suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith, everyone all down the street, the sweet stuff seller, coconut shy proprietor, and his assistant, the swingman, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, smocked elders, and apron gypsies, began running towards the inn, and in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in front of Mrs. Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was babble. A small group supported Mrs. Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference, and the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. "Oh, bogey, what's he been doing then? Ain't hurt the girl, has he? Run and with a knife, I believe. No end, I tell ye. I don't remember no manner of speaking. I mean, man without a head. Nonsense. 'Tis some conjuring trick. Fetched off his wrapping he did. In it struggles to see in through the open door. The crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex nearest the inn. He stood for a moment. I heard the gal scream, and he turned. I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with a knife in his hand and a loaf. Stood just as if he was staring. Not a moment ago. Went in that there door. I tell here, got no head at all. You just missed un. There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First, Mr. Hall, very red and determined. Then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable. And then the wary Mr. Wadgers. They had come now, armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. Head or no head, said Jaffers. I got to arrest them, and arrest them I will. Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door of the parlour and flung it open. Constable, he said, do your duty. Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Wadgers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure facing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. That's him, said Hall. What's the devil's this? Came in a tone of angry expostulation from above the collar of the figure. You're a damn rum customer, mister, said Mr. Jaffers. But head or no head, the warrant says body, and duty's duty. Keep off, said the figure, starting back. Abruptly he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove, and was slapped in Jaffers' face. In another moment, Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him in the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding along the table to Wadgers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the stranger swayed and staggered towards him, clutching and hitting him. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. Get the feet, said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavouring to act on instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Wadgers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huxter and the Sitterbridge carter coming to the rescue of law and order. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier and shot a web of pungence into the air of the room. I'll surrender, cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down. And in another moment he stood up, panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now, as well as his left. It's no good, he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world. to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space. But the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by a dim realization of the incongruity of the whole business. "Darn it, can't use them as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huckster suddenly, "that's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes. I could put my arm—" He extended his hand. It seemed to meet something in mid-air, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice in a tone of savage expostulation. "The fact is, I'm all here. Head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it, but it happens I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin in Ipin, is it?" The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo. Several other of the men folks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded. "Invisible, eh?" said Huckster, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Whoever heard the likes of that?" "It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by police in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant, and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility, it's burglary. There's a house being broke into and money took." "Well, and circumstances certainly point—" "Stuff and nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir, but I've got my instructions." "Well," said the stranger, I'll come, but no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that," said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped at the waistcoat. It struggled, and the shirt slipped out of it and left it limp and empty in his hand. "Hold him," said Jaffers loudly. "Once he get the things off." "Hold him," cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his own armed advance and sent him backwards into old Tootsome, the sexton, and in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it, and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth of the air. and incontinently threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out," said everybody, fencing at random and hitting at nothing. "Hold him! Shut the door! Don't let him loose! I got something! Here he is!" A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once. And Sandy Wadgers, knowing as ever, and his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and let her out. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Henfrey was injured in the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck onto the jaw and, turning, caught at something that intervened between him and Uxter in the melee and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall. "I got him! I got him!" shouted Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly towards the house door and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight, nevertheless, and making play with his knees, spun around and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited cries of "Hold him!" "Invisible!" and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place, whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road, a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran, howling, into Huxter's yard, and with that the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space people stood, amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic, and scattered them abroad through the village as a gust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still, face upward, and knees bent, at the foot of the steps of the inn. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief, and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple of miles of him, as he thought, and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound as of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and looking behind, beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear with that breadth and verity that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away in the distance, going, as it seemed to him, in the direction of Adderdean. It lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquillity vanished. He got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill towards the village as fast as he could. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a licorice, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to embonpoint. His short limbs accentuated this inclination. He wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, apparent at critical points of his costume, marked a man, essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch by the roadside, over the down towards Aberdeen, about 1.5 miles out of Hibbing. His feet, save for socks of irregular open work, were bare. His big toes were broad and prickled like the ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner. He was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but too large for him. Whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather, a very comfortable fit, but too thin-soled for damp. Mr. Thomas Marvel hated roomy shoes, but then he hated damp. He had never properly thought out which he hated most, and it was a pleasant day, and there was nothing better to do. For he put the 4 shoes in a graceful group on the turf and looked at them. And seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him. "They're boots. Anyone?" said the voice. "They are charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with his head on one side, regarding them distastefully. "And which is the ugliest pair in the whole blessed universe, I'm darned if I know." Said the voice. "I've worn worse, in fact. I've worn none. But none so audacious ugly, if you'll allow the expression. I've been catching boots in particular for days, because I was sick of them. They're sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramp sees such a thundering lot of his boots. And if you'll believe me, I've raised nothing in the whole beside country, try as I would, but them. Look at them. And a good country for boots too, in a general way. But it's just my promiscuous luck. I've got my boots in this country 10 years or more, and then they treat you like this." "It's a beast of a country," said the voice, "and pigs for people." "Ain't it?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Lord, but them boots, it beats it." He turned his head over his shoulder to the right to look at the boots of his interlocutor, with a view to comparisons, and lo, where the boots of his interlocutor should have been were neither legs nor boots. He was eradicated by the dawn of a great amazement. "Where are you?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel over his shoulder, and coming on all fours. He saw a stretch of empty downs, with the wind swaying, the remote green pointed furze bushes. "Am I drunk?" said Mr. Marvel. "Have I had visions? Was I talking to myself? What the—" "Don't be alarmed," said a voice. "None of your ventriloquism me," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rising sharply to his feet. "Where are you?" "Alarmed indeed." "Don't be alarmed," repeated the voice. "You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool," said Thomas Marvel. "Where are you? Let me get my mark on you." "Are you buried?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. After an interval, there was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed, his jacket nearly thrown off. "Pewit," said a Pewit very remote. "Pewit indeed," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "This ain't no time for foolery." The down was desolate. East and west, north and south, the road with its shallow ditches and white bordering stakes ran smooth and empty north and south, and save for the Pewit, the blue sky was empty too. "So help me," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, shuffling his coat onto his shoulders again. "It's the drink. I might have known." "It's not the drink," said the voice. "You keep your nerves steady." Oh, poor Mr. Thomas Marvel. Join me for the next video of Invisible Man. Join me for the next video of Invisible Man. I look forward to seeing you then. See you the next video. Okay.